I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. You like to move it, move it, move it. All girls all over the world. Original King Julien Cake, man. I love how all the girls move their body. And when you move your body, you don't move it nice and sweet and sassy, alright? Woman, you're cute, and you don't need no makeup. Original cute body makeup on model. Woman, you're cute, and you don't need no makeup. Original cute body makeup on model. Woman, physically fit, physically fit, physically fit. Woman, physically fit, physically fit, physically fit. Woman, nice, sweet, fantastic. Big ship on the ocean at the big Titanic. Woman, nice, sweet, energetic. Big ship on the ocean at the big Titanic. Woman, nice, sweet, fantastic. The ocean is a big Titanic, woman and nice, sweet, fantastic. Big ship on the ocean is a big Titanic. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. You like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. You like to move it, move it, move it. Woman, you cute, and you don't need no makeup. Original cute body makeup on model. Woman, you cute, and you don't need no makeup. Original cute body makeup on model. Eyeliner, on your face and make one mud up. Nose powder, on your face and make one mud up. Like your eyebrow, on your face and make one mud up. Gun your lipstick, on your face and make one mud up. Woman, you nice broad face, and a nice hip. Make man flip and bust them lip. Woman, you nice and you don't get thick. Big ship on the ocean at the big Titanic. Woman, a nice broad face, and a nice hip. Make man flip and bust them lip. Woman, you nice and you don't get thick. Big ship on the ocean at the big Titanic. Whoa! I like to move it, move it. He like to move it, move it. She like to move it, move it. You like to move it. They like to move it, move it. You like to move it, move it. I like. Oh, did I? Have I done I? Did I do? I like to. I think I did. I like. We. What about we? They. They did they as well. Okay. Oh, I got it. I got the new one. I got the new one. Them? No, is that, can I say them or not? Them like to move it, move it. I'm gonna say them. Them like to move it, move it. We like to move it, move it. Wait, there's gotta be another one. We, us. Oh, us? Can you do us like to? Us like to move it, move it. That's the one. Like to move it, move it. Us like to move it, move it. Us like to move it, move it. Move it, move it. Move it, move it. Move it. Forward. Okay then. While you're here, I just want to tell you a little story. It's an old story that my daddy used to tell me. He was a king as well. I was born probably about 68 years ago, over by that tree over there, yeah. And I remember things changed a lot. In those days in Madagascar, it wasn't so commercial, you know? It wasn't all about money and who's got the latest tree and what leaves are you wearing and who's got the latest fur on their back, you know. Those days it was just me and a couple of the others, you know, doing the jungle boogie, you know. Jungle boogie. Jungle boogie. Ha, 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 ha. Move it, move it, move it. Do you really think this is never gonna end? Because it is. 3, 2, 1. Not bad, eh? I like it.
know it's a very lengthy tutorial, but the Lookout Tower has a lot of details and we're going to cover all of them, and I hope you bear with me. First of all, I searched for an image of the Paw Patrol Lookout Tower on Google, and then I enlarged it to the right size that I wanted the cake to be. And then I divided it into 3 different sections. We have the bottom part, the middle part, and the top part. Before I can start filling my cake, I need to prepare my cake boards. And the bottom and middle part of the tower has an octagon shape. So I made 2 squares on my cake board that formed an octagon, and then I cut it into size. The bottom part of the tower is wider and it slants a bit into the middle part. So I measured my template and then I cut 4 pieces. So 2 larger pieces for the bottom and the middle part, and 2 smaller pieces for the section that connects in between. For the bottom part of the tower, I baked 2 square chocolate cakes, and I used my larger octagon shape to cut it into squares. After I've cut my cake into squares, I measured the height of the bottom part of the tower of my template and measured the height of my chocolate cake squares, and I added the right amount of squares to get the right height. Now it's time to fill the cake with some buttercream, and I use some white chocolate buttercream in between my chocolate cake layers because that's my son's favorite flavor. After I've stacked and filled all the layers, I made sure the cake was level. And then I applied a buttercream coat on top and placed a smaller octagon on top of that, and then let it chill in the fridge before carving it into the right shape. Now I'm repeating the same steps for the middle part of the tower, and I'm using some Oreo buttercream here with vanilla cake. After my cake has been chilled for a minimum of 1 hour in the fridge, I took it out and I used the cake board as a guide for cutting it into the right shape. Flip the cake and use the smaller template on the other side to cut it down as well. To make the edges straighter, I place the cake sideways and use the bottom and top part of my cake board to place the knife against, so I can cut some straight lines. When I was happy with the shape, I applied a crumb coat and chilled it in the fridge for another hour, and then I applied a final buttercream coat. To make the corners of this octagon-shaped cake as cleanly and sharp as possible, I scraped off the excess buttercream with my bench scraper, first sideways and then upwards, using the cake boards as a guide for when to stop and when to begin. It's really important to let the cake chill in between the crumb coat and the final coat, so the buttercream solidifies and then it's easier to scrape off the excess. The larger octagon-shaped cake board merely was used as a guide, so I removed it at this stage and applied some buttercream on top because I need to add some dowels into this cake at a later stage. Repeat the same process of carving, crumb coating, and final coating your bottom part of the Lookout Tower, but in this case you can remove the smaller octagon cake boards. The bottom part of the Lookout Tower has some side details, and I measured my template and cut some cake boards into the right shape. So I measured the height, the width, and the length. I cut the cake into strips that has the same width as my template. Then I measured how many strips I needed to get the right height, and I measured the length and cut it into the right size. Then I added some white chocolate buttercream in between my cake layers and let it chill in the fridge for an hour. Before carving, I made sure my sides were completely straight, so I used a serrated knife to carve off any excess. And then I used my cake board to carve the cake into the right shape. The way I crumb coated this cake is a bit unconventional, but in this manner I made sure that both of my side details were completely identical. So I placed a sheet of baking paper onto my turntable and apply a generous amount of buttercream, and then I placed my filled cake on top of it and placed my cake board on top of the cake. And then I scrape my buttercream upwards to the template and use it as a guide. So I scraped upwards and then sideways. Let this chill in the fridge for an hour as well, and then take it out and place a generous amount of buttercream on another piece of baking paper and then flip the cake on top of it. And then scrape the buttercream upwards again and sideways. Now we're moving on to filling the top part of the cake, and I divided this in different sections as well. So here you can see which section we're going to do first. I decided to make this section of the top part of the lookout tower out of Rice Krispie treats because it adds some stability to the cake. I heated my marshmallows into the microwave in 30-second intervals until it increased in volume, and then I stirred it with a greased spatula. I stirred into my Rice Krispies with the spatula first, and then I kneaded it with my hands, and my hands are greased as well, or else it will be a very sticky mess. After I've compacted the marshmallows and Rice Krispies, I pressed it into my baking pan and used a smaller baking pan to press it in really well at the edges. I've let this Rice Krispies treat set in the fridge overnight to let it firm up. I removed the Rice Krispie treats from my baking pan and applied a crumb coat and a final coat to this layer. I used the Paw Patrol Lookout Tower image and measured the width of every single section of the top part of my tower, so I knew which baking pans to use for my cakes, so it is in the exact same scale. This next section is made out of cake, and as you can see it slants a bit, so I took a smaller cake board than the diameter of my cake and used it as a guide to cut the sides. I applied a generous amount of buttercream onto my baking paper, placed the cake on top, and then attached the smaller cake board onto this cake and applied a crumb coat and a final coat as well. This next section slants a bit as well, but this is a higher cake, so I filled the cake in between with some Oreo buttercream, and then I chilled it in the fridge, and after I've chilled it, I've carved it into the right shape as my previous cake and crumb coated and final coated it as well. And repeat the same steps for the very top part of the cake. After I've applied a final coat of buttercream on all of my cakes, I let them chill in the fridge overnight to let them set completely firm. And now we're moving on to a very important step, and that is the structure. So I have an MDF cake board that is 1 centimeter thick, and I drilled a hole in the middle. So these are all the tools that you need to make this structure, and I'll also leave the details in the description box below. This tool needs to be hammered really tight into the cake board, and then you can screw your dowel rod inside of this. In this image, I show you what the height needs to be of your dowel rod to get the right stability for this cake. To make this structure food safe, I added some straws onto the dowel rod, and then I placed a bit of candy melt around the bolt on the bottom. The next step is to carefully slide the bottom part of your cake tower onto this dowel rod and press it in firmly so it sticks to the cake board. To securely stack this cake, I used some wooden dowels and cut all 4 pieces into the same height. I placed all 4 of my wooden dowels into the cake and added some candy melt on top of them and around the middle section of the rod. Then I carefully added my middle part of the tower and pressed it on tightly and make sure it fit. Then I added some buttercream to the seams in the middle and the bottom part of the cake and smoothed it out with the bench scraper. And then I added the side details of the bottom part of the lookout tower. I applied some buttercream to the seams as well and smoothed it out with the bench scraper again. And this is where I went wrong, guys. Sorry. This is the right way to place the side details. I'm just glad I found out on time. So with all the buttercreaming finally done, we can move on to decorating this cake with fondant. And first I wanted to add some fondant to the back of this cake, and I measured the height and half of the circumference. I rolled out some white fondant and then I used a ruler to cut it into the right measurements. And then I rolled my fondant onto my rolling pin and placed it onto the cake, and I used my hands to smooth it out into all the creases and corners. I also used a fondant smoother to make sure that my fondant was completely secure to my buttercream, and then I used a ruler to cut some straight sides. After this, I'm going to apply some fondant to the side details of this cake, and I measured the complete height and the width. And then I cut out a piece of white fondant into these measurements and applied it to the cake in the same way. And then I cut away the excess with a sharp knife. And lastly, I measured the height and width of the front part of the lookout tower and cut a strip of white fondant and added it to this. And then I smoothed out the seams with my fingers. I used the sugar craft gun to make a long red and yellow strip of fondant to apply around the bottom part of the cake. If you don't have a sugar craft gun, you can also roll out a strip of fondant with your rolling pin and cut it into the right size using a ruler or a ribbon cutter. I applied the fondant strips with some water onto the cake, and I used a fondant smoother to make sure that they are completely stuck and straight. And now repeat this for the yellow fondant strip. Now we're moving on to the front part of the lookout tower, and I believe this is the elevator. I cut the front part of the image that I used, and I rolled out some light blue and dark blue fondant, and then I traced it around my fondant. I applied the light blue strip of fondant with some water first, and then I cut the window parts of the template and traced it around the darker blue fondant and added this on top of the light blue fondant. I made a thick rectangular shape out of dark blue fondant, and this is where I'm going to attach the elevator door. I used the Paw Patrol lookout tower image to cut out the elevator door and the Paw Patrol logo, and then I rolled out some dark blue fondant and traced it around this cut part. And here I show you the steps that you need to use this template to make the elevator door. And just repeat these steps to make the Paw Patrol logo as well. It's just a matter of cutting all the parts and tracing it onto the right colored fondant. Okay, we're halfway there, just bear with me a little longer. We're moving on to the top part of the Paw Patrol lookout tower. And here we have the Rice Krispie treats, and I made a hole in the middle using a wooden dowel so I can slide it onto our cake structure. Because I don't want my cake board to be shown in the final result of the lookout tower, I'm adding some buttercream on top of this, and I'm placing my fondant all over the Rice Krispie treats. Flip the Rice Krispie treats upside down and cut away the excess fondant using a sharp knife. Then flip it again and use the fondant smoothers to smooth down the sides. I use a tappet cutter to make some black rectangular shapes, but if you have a rectangular cookie cutter, you can use this as well. And then I applied it with some water onto my Rice Krispie treats. I added 4 dowels into the middle part of my tower in the same way I did it for the bottom part, and then I applied the Rice Krispie treats on top and I use the cake board to really press it on tightly. Because this section is a bit wider than the Rice Krispie treats, I also applied some buttercream onto this cake board and completely covered it with fondant. Trim down the sides with a sharp knife and flip your cake over. And now I rolled out a piece of yellow fondant and attached it to the top of the cake and flipped it back again and cut down the sides with a sharp knife as well. And then I added a yellow fondant strip using the sugar craft gun again. And then carefully stack this cake on top of your cake tower. If your cake is a bit soft, just place it in the fridge first before you add it onto this cake tower to make sure it doesn't bulge. For the fence, I've cut out some dark blue fondant squares and rolled it around some toothpicks and placed them into the cake. I've cut out a cake board into the right size of the rim and applied it on top of the toothpicks with some candy melt. I applied some dark blue fondant on top of the cake board and pressed it down at the sides to make sure that it's completely covered. For the next part of the lookout tower, I measured the circumference and the height of my cake and rolled out a piece of black fondant into these measurements. And I rolled my piece of black fondant onto a plastic dowel to make it more easier to apply it onto the cake and my fondant won't stretch. Dust off any excess powdered sugar from your fondant or else it won't stick to the buttercream on the cake. When you've applied the fondant to the cake, use a ruler to cut a straight seam at the back and then you can remove the cake board. I'm removing this cake board because in the final end result I want to be able to slice all the way through to get a good slice of cake without getting interrupted by some cake boards. I covered my last piece of cake with some red fondant, flipped it upside down, removed the cake board and cut away the excess red fondant. I rolled out a thick piece of red fondant and used a cake board to make a nice circle, and I've let this harden for a few days. And now I can apply it on top of my cake without the sides drooping down. Add your tiny piece of red cake on top of it. I used the sugar craft gun with a square disc to make some strips, and the long strips go around the circumference of the cake and the shorter strips are the height of the cake, and these are the window sections. I applied all the pieces with some water and I used a measuring tape to even out the spaces in between the shorter strips of fondant. I made the front window in the same way that I made the elevator door using the template again. I applied some candy melt around the center dowel of my cake structure and placed the cake on top. The slide of the Paw Patrol lookout tower has a pedestal and it's sort of triangular, so I shaped this out of a piece of dark blue fondant and attached it to the cake with some water. For the slides I used strips of cake board and I measured the sides of the octagon, and that is the shorter side on these strips, and then I measured a 45-degree angle. That makes the larger side of these strips, and I've cut it into pieces and stuck two of them together with some double-sided tape and a toothpick in between. Place these cake boards into the cake and cut the conjoining corners with a scissor, and repeat this by placing all these cake boards diagonally upwards, and the last piece needs to end at the back. To make it a bit more stable, I taped all the corners together. I couldn't think of something that I could make days in advance that could dry because the measurements could be completely off because it's a cake and your buttercream layers can make it thicker or thinner. So I decided to make it inedible this time using some cake boards, and obviously you need to remove this before cutting and eating the cake. I rolled out some strips of gray fondant and attached it to the cake boards with some piping gel. Water just wouldn't hold up because it would just slide off of your cake boards. So piping gel is the right way to attach these. Attach a strip of gray fondant to the bottom and then add a strip of gray fondant on top. To make it easier to apply, I use short strips that go down every other corner, so there will be a seam every other corner as well. But this is where we need to place the yellow fondant strips, so these are going to be hidden. Pinch the bottom and the top gray fondant strip together and use a scissor to make a clean cut. I've rolled out some thin gray strips and then I applied it to the side of the cake where there may be any cracks or creases or just plain ugliness, and then I pinched it together, and as you can see it looks a lot nicer right now. Then I rolled out some yellow strips and I applied it to all of the seams. Moving on to the finishing part of the cake, I'm sculpting the lookout. I'm making a thick sausage of dark blue fondant and I'm cutting it into the right size. And then I'm cutting out a circle that has the same diameter as my dark blue fondant and I'm attaching it to the back side. I cut one side of my yellow fondant into a straight line and I'm placing my dark blue fondant on top, and then I'm cutting a straight line at the other side, but I'm not cutting it flush. I'm leaving a bit of space. And then I'm rolling the yellow fondant onto the dark blue fondant and cut it down at the seam. I'm cutting down a skewer at the right height and I'm leaving a bit of space on top and the bottom of my skewer because the top is going to be inserted into the lookout and the bottom part is going to be inserted into the cake. And then I'm rolling a piece of yellow fondant onto my skewer and then I'm attaching the lookout on top of it. It's actually pretty ironic because the song I'm using for this part is called Up All Night, and maybe you've noticed that the lighting has changed, and that's because I'm working at night right now. It was 3 o'clock at night when I finished this cake, and this project took me 2 full days. Then for the final finishing touches on the cake, I put some green fondant here and there on the cake board and around the lookout tower, and I used a grass tip to press it onto the fondant to make it more grass-like and to give it a bit of texture. And last but not least, I added all of the pops using some candy melt. And here it is, you guys, the final end result, and I love it. I'm so happy, my son was happy, and it was delicious. So I hope you give it a try. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and make sure you tap that subscribe button. And I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching, guys. Mwah.